Hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 4 Part 1, The Colonial Experience. The main idea behind this civics lesson is belief in self-government prompted colonists to rebel against English rule and win the American Revolution. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you will be able to describe the role colonists played in their government, define the rights and responsibilities of colonial citizens, identify the freedoms that early colonists struggled to gain, and explain why many colonists became dissatisfied with royal governors. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. Many of the American traditions we have today took root during the colonial period. The values and experiences of the settlers in the 13 English colonies make up an important part of our heritage, the traditions passed down to us from generation to generation. From the beginning, citizens in the 13 colonies were used to having a voice in their government. It was one of their rights as citizens of England. In each colony, citizens could elect representatives to the legislature, a group of people chosen to make laws. This gave them a degree of self-government that was rare in the world at that time. The beginning of representative government in America can be traced back to the year 1619, when the colonists of Virginia elected representatives called burgesses. This first colonial legislature, the Virginia House of Burgesses, was soon followed by other legislatures as more colonies were founded. The right to elect members of their legislature, however, did not give colonial citizens complete control of their government. They were still subject to the authority of England, whose monarch established each colony through a charter, a document giving permission to create a government. Any colony that seriously challenged England's authority might be stripped of its charter and become a royal colony under the control of the monarch, who appointed a royal governor. In theory, England had final authority over the colonies, and the English governor could reject laws passed by colonial legislatures. However, throughout the 1600s and early 1700s, England was busy fighting wars and had little time to pay attention to colonial laws. Thus, the colonists played a large role in governing themselves. Used to having a voice in government, colonial citizens resisted any efforts to ignore their rights or to weaken their legislatures. Typically, those efforts were made by colonial governors, who were usually appointed to their posts rather than elected, and who generally represented England's interests rather than those of the colonists. Some also represented proprietors, wealthy nobles or merchants who had been granted charters. From time to time, the legislatures became involved in power struggles with colonial governors and proprietors. For instance, the Virginia House of Burgesses declared that the governor could not tax citizens without the legislature's consent. Similarly, in 1641, the Massachusetts legislature passed laws protecting basic rights such as trial by jury. Many of our American rights and traditions can be traced back to the colonial period. However, being an English citizen in the 1600s and 1700s differed in some important ways from being an American citizen today. First of all, most people who can now vote in our country would have been denied that right in the English colonies. Usually only white men who owned a certain amount of land were allowed to vote or hold office. A common belief was that they were the people most affected by the laws. Also, only a wealthy man was thought to have enough education and free time to become involved in politics. In no colony could enslaved persons vote. Colonial laws not only denied them the right to vote, but it also treated them as property rather than as people. The European colonists wanted rights for themselves, but they denied rights to the Africans who were forced to come to the colonies as slaves. Although it was important to recognize that relatively few people in the colonies were allowed to vote, you should remember that citizens in most nations and colonies during the 1600s and early 1700s did not have any rights. The English colonies in America were among the few places in the world where citizens actually participated in their government. Colonial citizens, like citizens today, had a responsibility to work for the common good. They helped their communities in various ways, such as serving on juries and becoming members of the local militia or volunteer army. Citizens also served their communities by supporting education. For instance, the Puritans in New England set up a public school system to make sure that people could read and understand the Bible. Harvard College, the oldest university in the United States, was founded by the Puritans in 1636. In the middle and southern colonies, where there were few public schools, parents usually sent their children to private schools or taught them at home. We Americans have many freedoms. Among these are freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. Such individual freedoms, however, were unknown for most of human history. They became part of our heritage mainly through the efforts of the colonists. The colonists lived at a time when religion was closely tied to government in most parts of the world. All English citizens, for instance, had to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church as the official Church of England. Many colonists, including the Pilgrims on the Mayflower and the Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had left England because they were persecuted for disagreeing with the Anglican Church. Although the Puritans had fled persecution in England, they denied religious freedom to those who disagreed with them. They forced a minister named Roger Williams to leave their colony after he criticized church leaders. In 1636, Williams founded the colony of Rhode Island, whose charter promised that no colonists would be punished for any differences in opinions in matters of religion. Before long, other colonies were also allowing religious freedom. Actually, the colonists' definition of religious freedom differed from our definition today. They usually meant that a person could belong to any Christian church, such as the Presbyterian or Anglican churches. They did not mean freedom for members of non-Christian religions. Nonetheless, considering the world in which they lived, the colonists were taking an important step, one that would eventually lead to freedom of religion for all Americans. When colonial newspapers appeared in the early 1700s, they became an important source of information. Freedom of the press, however, did not exist in England or in the English colonies. Under English law, a publisher was not allowed to criticize the government. One of the earliest arguments for freedom of the press was made in 1735 in a crowded New York City courtroom. On trial was John Peter Zenger, the publisher of a newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal. Zenger had printed articles accusing the New York governor of abusing his power by accepting bribes and interfering with elections. Furious, the governor had burned copies of the newspaper and had jailed Zenger, accusing him of trying to stir up rebellion against the government. Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, argued that Zenger was innocent if what he had written was true. Hamilton declared that freedom of the press was a basic right. The question before the court is not of small nor private concern. It may, in its consequence, affect every free person that lives under a British government. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty, the liberty both of exposing and opposing arbitrary power by speaking and writing truth. After hearing Hamilton's argument, the jury left the room to discuss the case. When the 12 jurors returned, the spectators leaned forward in their chairs. A member of the jury stood to announce the verdict. "Not guilty," he declared. Loud cheers filled the packed courtroom. Zenger was released from jail and went back to publishing his newspaper. Although the verdict freed Zenger, it did not change English law, and therefore it did not actually guarantee freedom of the press in America. However, the Zenger case did inspire other colonists to continue the fight for freedom of the press and to criticize governors who abused their power. By the mid-1700s, England had tightened its control over the colonies, making most of them royal colonies. Like Zenger, many colonists were angry at royal governors who used power without regard for citizens' rights. Some governors ordered citizens' homes to be searched without warning. Zenger's lawyers had spoken of arbitrary power or abuse of power, which was more frequently called tyranny. As people complained about royal governors, the word tyranny was increasingly used throughout the colonies. A growing number of colonists began to wonder whether England might eventually try to strip them of their rights and silence their voice in government. So that's the way it is with Lesson 4, Part 1, the colonial experience. At this point, you should know that the heritage of American representative government and many of its rights and traditions can be traced to colonial times, and the modern American guarantees of freedom of religion and freedom of the press, while not as widely defined as they are today, have their foundations in the colonial experience. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of civics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons. See ya!